All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa, the return of Evan McMullen. Evan was a previous, we would call it sense maker in residence at the time, started a series called The Bridge, which is a really awesome series. And Evan's returning to be the Stoa's October Philosopher-in-Residence. And The Bridge is also returning with him. And the title of the series, and it's a mouthful, The Trolls Under the Bridge, Intersubjective Parasitology, Computational Demonology, and Things That Go Bump in the Dark Night of the Soul. Oof. So that will give you a teaser of what this thing is, and I'm super excited about this series. And it's a 5-part series, and each session is going to be 90 minutes. And Evan, I'm going to take him in a moment, and he's going to share his screen, present, and then it's going to take me back in, and we're going to have Q&A. So if you have questions anytime, pop them in the chat. I'll call on you. You can ask Evan your question. And if you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that, and I will read your question on your behalf. So that being said, Evan, my friend, welcome back to Stoa. So good to have you.
Thank you. It's so good to be back. I think it's been a bit over a year at this point since I've presented something on the Stoa, and it definitely feels like the right time to do so again. So this is what's been on my mind and heart lately, and I don't really know how to talk about anything that's not what's on my mind and heart. So this is what's alive for me, and I think people might find it to be of relevance to bigger things in the world, things that are relevant to each of us. So I'm hoping that will be the case, and excited to share either way, and yeah, ready to get going.
Cool. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, we can. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Let me see if I have permissions to do that. All right. So do you guys see a presentation type thing? Cool. So basically the title is The Trolls Under the Bridge. So and then the subtitle, which you read, is up on the screen. So I won't go too deep into that right now, because we're going to spend the first little bit talking about, like, why the hell does it have this title? What is this even about? So under what bridge, first of all? So the Trolls Under the Bridge, what's the bridge? So my previous sessions on the Stoa were titled The Bridge. There's, I think, 6 or 7 or 8 or 9, something like that in total on the playlist you can find on the Stoa YouTube if you're interested in going deeper into that material. So this was riffing on an article by David Chapman in his Meaningness hypertext book / website, which was titled A Bridge to Meta-Rationality versus Civilizational Collapse. And meta-rationality is a sort of thing that David holds up as a part of the implications of what he views as a sort of goal state of human development, of what he relates to as having to do with Keegan stage 5, the fluid mode, some non-duality stuff thrown in there. It's an interesting concept, and one that I resonated with quite a bit. So took that as a jumping off point, and talked a lot about the nature of paths, as in spiritual paths, paths of discovery, paths of awakening, paths of enlightenment, etc. And I was interested in this as a metaphor. Peter, I think you actually gave the name to the sessions, the bridge. Peter's got a wonderful skill at naming, as almost a magical act here. And so it was the perfect name. So the word bridge is often used as a metaphor in this, both in normal language and in my content, for the bridging of many different things: developmental stages, subjective and intersubjective states, the philosophies of science and woo, different human perspectives and minds, etc. And so I think there's a reason bridging or bridges are a natural metaphor for human minds to use, such that the Catholics, following after the Romans, referred to their high priest as the Pontifex Maximus, which literally means the biggest bridge builder. And so, again, bridging is a natural metaphor to me for the overlap in the sort of Venn diagram between spirituality, science, and religion, the thing which exists in all of those fields of human endeavor and human study. So that's the sort of bridge that we're talking about here, is that sort of bridge. And so what trolls? What do I mean by troll? Well, people who've seen my stuff before know that I'm a huge geek for etymology, the origins of words through time. And so our English word troll comes from an Old Norse word, troll, which has a meaning not like a big scaly thing that's got green skin and weird facial features. That's from a bit later on. But it has a connotation of a witch or a mage or a conjurer. And this word in Old Norse itself is from a Proto-Germanic root, something like trulza, which means a generalized supernatural being, specifically a demonic or fiendish or giant one, a big monster of the supernatural variety, which itself comes from likely the aorist tense of a Proto-Germanic verb here, which means to tread or to have stepped on, which itself most likely comes from the Proto-Indo-European root drem, which is where we get a lot of words meaning to run and also to sleep. So, like drama comes from this root, among other words. The word dream in English and Germanic languages comes from this root. So, already we're kind of getting right to why the trolls would be under the bridge, right? Trolls are magical, witchy, magical, demonic giant monsters that are associated with dreaming and sleeping and running and stepping on, as in treading on, as in what do you walk over? You walk over a bridge. So, as I have on the slide, trolls are the magical stuff that one might tread on or run over, as in a dream or when walking over a bridge, especially out of some kind of dream world, a bridge out of a dream world, a bridge into wakefulness, as we can see per the etymology. So let's take a look at the next part of the title. What the hell is intersubjective parasitology? So, kind of starting here with this quote from Cory Doctorow, who many of you may know of, who has this quote: all complex ecosystems have parasites. And I tweaked that a little bit for the session description. All complex ecosystems evolve parasites, but whatever. So that's where we're starting from here, is that all complex ecosystems will eventually evolve niches which are parasitic in nature. And so, what does intersubjective mean? Well, around these corners of the internet, at least, we often refer to with words like intersubjectivity or the group field. We're talking about the emergence of novel complexity from this latent space of potentiality of the interaction between human minds. This thing, whatever we want to call it, intersubjectivity maybe, is really fertile ground for the evolution of a complex ecosystem. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin talks about this in The Phenomenology of Man, where he also speaks of the omega point. He talks about this sort of additive emergent complexity coming from, layering of physical matter and then cellular biological life that then evolves minds that then evolves into something, he called the omega point. So he calls this the lithosphere to biosphere to noosphere thing. So we're talking about parasites that live in the noosphere rather than parasites that live in the biosphere, like the animal parasites we're all familiar with. So parasitology is the study of parasites and parasitism. So parasitism I'm defining here as a subclass of predatory relationship where the predator doesn't eat the prey all at once and often doesn't directly kill the prey at all. While it's still bad for the prey, it's still probabilistically and causally lowering the inclusive evolutionary fitness of the prey, of the targeted prey. So continuing to speak of intersubjective parasitology for a bit here. So the intersubjective, which emerges from the interactions of minds, is a complex mimetic ecosystem. And all complex ecosystems evolve parasites. So taking these two things as granted, then there must exist parasites which parasitize other entities and do so at the mimetic or noospheric level of emergent complexity rather than the physical. So you're not necessarily going to see these things literally sucking out your blood, our precious bodily fluids, right? It's something a bit more subtle than that, a bit less material than that, while nonetheless being quite real and part of the objective world. So if we value, love and choice and all the other good human stuff, I think we ought to invest at least some time and effort into the study of these dynamics, into the study of intersubjective parasitology, so that the parasites at least have, a harder time extracting our energy and negentropy from us, from our minds, from our human interactions. So that's kind of the motivation for this series of sessions. And so then the next part of the title has to do with computational demonology. So what am I talking about when I talk about that? Well, it's another lens for me on the same phenomena, using the languages, in this case, of things like computer science and information theory, therefore we get computational, to classify algorithms, which are implemented as a distributed computation across multiple human brains, networked through things like speech and body language and energetics, which are these algorithms, demons, trolls, intersubjective parasites, or as we commonly talk of in this corner of discourse space here at the Stoa, egregores. So I've done a couple sessions where I've mentioned egregores before, but many of you might not have been here. And I just kind of want to recap from a different frame. What are we talking about when we talk about egregores? So the word egregore is ultimately derived from Greek, from egregoros, which means wakeful or watchful, sort of an adjectival noun. And it's used to refer to the same kind of mythologically relevant beings which are described in various books of the Abrahamic traditions as Irene, in Aramaic or Hebrew, which means watchers or wakeful ones. So it's sort of a direct translation of that. And in books like Enoch and Jubilees and Daniel, these are described as fallen angels who came down to earth and sired children upon human women, which children were known as the Nephilim, which is often translated from the Hebrew and Aramaic as giants, which is kind of an interesting similarity here to the concept of the oldest Norse meaning of trolls and that Proto-Germanic root of that. So if you look at the way that the word giant is used in something quite old in the Germanic tradition, like the Poetic Edda, specifically in Voluspa, which is a book of prophecy where essentially Odin has like raised up the dead spirit of an extremely powerful witch who was there at the beginning of time and is asking her to tell him how the world's going to end and how the gods are going to die. This is where we get the story of Ragnarok from, basically, and he's trying to figure out how to avert this catastrophe. And so, the giants in Norse mythology were not necessarily very tall physically. They were trolls. They were egregoric. They were Nephilim. These are all very closely related sort of occult or mythological concepts, which I think are related in this interesting way because there's a sort of common generator function for them and deep human experience. And so in the more recent contemporary Western magical traditions, the word is used to refer to, as Wikipedia has it, an occult concept representing a non-physical entity that arises from the collective thoughts of a distinct group of people, which is pretty similar to the way I defined an intersubjective parasite on the previous slide. So noting that. So let's try to bridge these concepts. So parasites are a kind of predator in terms of ecosystemic niche and trophic level in a trophic hierarchy. A trophic hierarchy is the levels at which things eat each other, right? So, you have like cows eat grass, so they're at a higher trophic level than grass. And then we eat cows, so we're at a higher trophic level than cows, and so on. And so intersubjectivity is a complex ecosystem. It's fertile ground for a complex ecosystem. So we should expect to see parasites in the intersubjective field. And so troll was basically the old Norse word for these sorts of parasites. And they seem to be attracted to metaphorical bridges across minds and out of dreaming and illusion and delusion as likely hunting grounds. Now, my hypothesis for why this is the case is because the process of freeing one's mind, liberating the energy and structures trapped in one's mind and moving to a new level of awareness essentially releases a lot of the sort of thing that you might think of as food or energy for a noospheric or intersubjective organism. So thus these egregores, trolls, computational demons, intersubjective parasites, whatever you want to call them, are the sort of things which go bump in the dark night of the soul. So this is a long-winded way, as I'm prone to, of explaining the title of the sessions overall. I wanted to provide some sort of grounding orientation for like what we're going to be looking at, and hopefully the why is obvious, but I'm going to go into a bit more of that through a worked example. So there's a phenomenon I think I've noticed in human societies throughout time and history, and so far as we have that's very much alive and active today, that I call a Cordyceps egregore. So people may be familiar with the existence of a group of fungi that we call Cordyceps, and they have a life cycle which parasitizes insects. In particular, they tend to target eusocial hymenopteran insects. So think hive insects, termites, wasps, bees, ants, that kind of thing, right? So the life cycle looks something like this. And I've generalized because there's a ton of different Cordyceps species. So this is a sort of general pattern. You'll find different Cordyceps species parasitizing different specific hymenopteran species that have some variations from this. But, this is pretty easy to Google. I just wanted to give an idea of the basic sort of, structure that we're talking about here. So first you have some spores and they land on an ant and attach to it. And then the spores germinate into mycelia. They make their way inside of the insect's body and germinate and start forming a mycelial network using the substrate of the insect's body and internal cavities and as food, basically. And these mycelia preferentially seek out the primitive nervous system of the insect. And then next, the mycelial network starts producing neurotransmitter analogs that allow it to puppeteer, puppet master, directly take control of the nervous and then limbic systems of the particular insect that's been infected. And then this control is used to cause the insect to behave less eusocially. I'm going to pause here and define eusocial. So it's like a more extreme version of prosocial. When we talk about the way that insect colony organisms that are hymenoptera, like bees and ants, like the whole colony is basically one organism. They're working towards the reproductive success of the queen or small group of queens. And most of the workers are sterile and are fine with that and are just, everybody's kind of playing nicely and working together. Eu in Greek is a prefix that means good social. So like really good social behavior. And so instead, this infected worker begins hoarding food and resources for itself, which is at this point actually the fungal parasite. It knows not what it does. It's being puppeteered by the fungal parasite. And then eventually, this control, once the insect has been fattened up enough, is used to pilot this overfat insect to a location. In a rainforest, it might be a leaf overhanging the hive, or, there's various ways this can work, where a lot of other ants will be foraging or, other eusocial insects. And then the insect is basically sacrificed to the fungus. A fruiting body is produced. A little mushroom comes out of the head or thorax of the insect. And then poof, the spores go out. And so we go to this is a life cycle. We go back to the first step. And this is the life cycle of Cordyceps in a pretty general way. So some of these fungi will do other subtle things, like they will additionally manipulate the insect's pheromonic epigenetics. So that, the ways that the insect's pheromone system gets expressed based on its genetics, such that it produces pheromones which cause other ants to regard it as a queen, a reproductively viable queen ant, and bring food to it and protect it, thereby redirecting resources away from the collective organism that we might call a eusocial hymenopteran hive and towards the parasitic fungus life form. So obviously for an ant colony, a beehive, a termite mound or whatever, it's having its inclusive fitness lowered by contact with such beings. So let's ask ourselves how this might apply to humanity. Obviously, we are not vulnerable to infection by literal fungal cordyceps. In fact, cordyceps species tend to be some of the best, like adaptogenic and anti-cancer, all the beneficial medicinal mushrooms for us when we powder them and dry them and make tinctures and so on. Paul Stamets is all about this kind of thing, for example. Nothing wrong with cordyceps as a fungus that happens to mess with ants a bit. But let's talk about what I call the Cordyceps Aggregor. So I think one lens through which we can look at the development of historical phenomena, like the development of caste systems, chattel slavery, and other forms of privilege, is to think of them as the materially and socially visible side effects of the infection of our intersubjectivity of our society by an egregore, which has a similar relationship to specific human cultures as cordyceps species do to eusocial insect colony organisms, aka insect hives. So remember, humans are also colony organisms all the way down. I've spoken about this on the Stoa quite a bit and dialogue with Forrest Landry and Benita Roy and my own sessions. Something I like to talk about a lot, that, if you look at the evolution of life, you had different kinds of bacteria and archaea come together and figure out how to collaborate, how to enter symbiosis as opposed to parasitism or predation, such that we have organelles called mitochondria or chloroplasts in eukaryotic life. And then these eukaryotic single-celled forms, again, come together and form a colony that leads to colony organisms of identical single-celled organisms at first, things like Volvox, and then moves on to the differentiated, genetically identical yet phenotypically differentiated colony organism cell structures that are typical of what we think of as multicellular life. And so With humans, this is taken to a real extreme. We've evolved really strong differentiation between nervous cells, nervous system tissue, and muscle tissue and bone, osteoplasts and so on. And yet each one of them contains the same core copy of our genome. So we're all one organism, but we're a colony of tiny little, there's 10 to the 13th human cells in our body roughly. And each of those has almost all of them have mitochondria, which have their own bacterial DNA. And then there's also 10 to the 14th bacterial and archaea cells, mainly in our gut, our microbiome. So we're a colony of archaea and bacteria and eukaryotic animal cells just working together in harmony to create this wonderful thing we call the human experience. So slavery, caste systems, privilege, the creation of hierarchies of perception, etc. All of these are really suboptimal ways for a human colony organism, a colony organism made up of full human bodies and their minds, to arrange the flow of information and signal processing and sense making. This is not the way that humans, we can all feel in our hearts, really ought to work. And so their persistence indicates a sort of mimetic or egregoric kind of infection or parasitism. This is the model I'm using here, basically. And so there's a term called Kiriarchy, which comes from critical feminist theology, and it's now pretty widely used in the context of intersectional social justice and critical theory writ large. It means roughly a social system or set of connecting social systems built around domination, oppression, and submission. This is the first sentence from the Wikipedia article, basically, and it's quite literal. I mean, Kyrios in Greek is a master, with the implication of like a master who owns slaves, a slave owner, basically. So, Kiriarchy, labeling things as Kiriarchy is the assertion that the people on top are the sort of people with the same orientation as a slave owner, a dominator, rule by dominators, basically, is what Kiriarchy literally translates as. And so, as I mentioned just a second ago, it really does not appear, if you do a sort of survey of, the remaining indigenous types of cultures existing at sort of Dunbar scale, or even like pretty significantly above Dunbar scale of, a few thousands and tens of thousands, that this doesn't appear to be the way that humans sort of generally naturally organize themselves in the many different environments of evolutionary adaptation that the human species has found itself in. So therefore, I think there is a hypothesis space worth exploring here about whether it is, Kiriarchy, privilege, slavery, things like that, whether they are in fact just a simple evolutionary adaptation by our species to additional complexity, which is a hypothesis I don't favor but must consider, or the more sinister hypothesis, which I think actually fits the data better, is that these are the visible result or side effects of intersubjective parasitism by an egregore living at a higher trophic level than specific human cultures. So some consequences of this frame, a quote that I've thrown up on the Stoa before is the left eats its children, the right digs up its dead, which is describing the characteristic pathologies of the political left and the political right. I think we can all perhaps understand what it's gesturing at. So I think that, disputes of the form oppression Olympics, where people are competing to see how disprivileged they are according to the current dominant hierarchy and therefore deserving of sympathy or victim status, and other ways in which the social justice left essentially ends up turning on itself, engaging in intergenerational conflict, sort of metaphorically eating its own children, such that no one can agree if the big bad of this season of, the humanity show is sexism, is it racism, is it ableism, is it patriarchy, is it, who knows, right? So you might view this sort of like dispute on the left, this inter-left sort of dispute, as the result of a crypsis strategy by Cordyceps egregores to futz with, to fuzz our sense making and avoid detection, avoid proper identification. And similarly, I think that, when you look on the political right, the fascination that they have with the ancient and the traditional and the old ways might be a sort of somewhat natural human response to subtle perceptions of this parasite, in attempting to sort of ultimately futilely roll back the clock on humanity to an earlier state when the parasite's virtual mycelial network was less fully developed. So let's discuss this. I know that was a pretty short presentation and we have a 90-minute session, but the way I construct these sessions at the Stoa is in dialogue with the community. So I really wanted to leave the majority of this initial session, after doing a sort of orientation to the concept space, for the group that's gathered here today to have a discussion, which will help me then determine what's going to be of the greatest value to the group that's likely to show up for the rest of the session. So I'd like to Peter, turn it back over to you if you want to start running Q&A or have a brief dialogue between us, or however you want to do this. It's about that time.
Yeah. So anyone, if you had any questions, pop up in the chat, and I'll call you. You can ask your question, Evan. Let's see if I have any question that's alive right now. Maybe a personal one. I know we spoke about this last time we jumped on a call, but what captured you about this subject, egregores, and then the kind of like the wild research you've been on lately in order to sense into it?
So yeah, there is basically not much I can speak about publicly with respect to the wild research I've been on, unfortunately, at this time. But I can give some general comments about the nature of it. Basically, I've since the last time I was well, we called it a sense maker in residence back then, a philosopher in residence, doing a long thing on the Stoa. I have left my employment as a mechatronics engineer and struck out on my own in the world, and have tried to orient my activities to be of service, basically to both people I care about and have individual connections with, as well as just humanity and society more broadly. And so as a result of my attempt to match my skill set with my intuition that I ought to try to be of service to the greatest number of people, I started encountering a bunch of interesting and weird kind of roadblocks, obstacles, like things that didn't seem to be working out the way I would have naively expected. And so this has caused me to basically start investigating, well, what's the generator of that? Why am I encountering these sorts of obstacles I didn't predict? Why is it so much harder to help people than you would naively expect it is? And well, this is the result. Basically, is this is the sort of framing which I was initially quite reluctant to apply to the current, broader social and cultural and world political situation. But the more I observe, I don't really think I'm doing a model overfitting thing here. I was quite disinclined, in fact, to use such models as anything more than a little bit tongue-in-cheek kind of fun thing to talk about, a couple of years ago. But it's like, well, shit, this does actually seem like what's going on. And I can talk about some sort of specific examples, less from my life, because like I said, when you're doing the sorts of things that I find myself doing, you're often finding yourself in a position of deep trust with people where you don't want to just speak super publicly about what you've gone through with people that are having a difficult time in their life. That doesn't feel very kind. But as far as the generalities, to like so the specific generalities, if that makes sense, we all often, I think, find ourselves in situations where people are acting against their own best interests, right? And I mean, you have framings on this that are, so one of the articles that caused the at least the rationalist and post-rationalist adjacent communities, mimetic tribes, however you want to think of that, to start talking about egregores was a wonderful article that Scott wrote, called Meditations on Moloch, right? And so relating to this thing, Moloch as an egregore, but like Moloch in that essay is framed as sort of the god or the egregore of coordination problems. And I think that this actually gets, this actually gets to a disagreement that I have with Scott and with many people in the sort of rationalist adjacent spaces, where the framing there is that coordination is actually really hard. And my answer is that no, I'm sorry, it can't be. Like, we have so much compute available in our brains, and like bacteria and archaea figured out how to coordinate with each other such that they are our ancestors, the ancestors of all multicellular life. And they had so much less compute available to them. So like, we obviously aren't super compute bound in figuring out principled answers to coordination problems. There's something a little bit weirder going on with why we seem to have such a difficult time coordinating for the greater good. That's my strong intuition, and what I see as the result of my investigation at this point. So, sorry, rationalists who like Moloch, I just don't actually think that that is the root cause of the sorts of problems that, say, that article states that that coordination problems are in fact the root cause of. I mean, a lot of things get called tragedies of the commons, but like, wait, like Forrest and Bonita and I talked about a couple years ago on the Stoa, it seems like something has been eating the commons, and it's not just individual people. So, that's sort of like the flavor of where I'm coming from, and I'm happy to, go into something more specific with a little bit more direction, with the caveat that like the exact specific, like I was in this place in this time sort of lived experiences that generated a lot of this content are not something I can in good conscience speak of publicly.
Cool. So yeah, I imagine some of that will unfold in the series. So we have some good questions popping in the chat. So we'll tag in Hazard. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Lovely to see you.
Beautiful. Good to see you, Evan. So yeah, the questions like how do you think about what egregores eat? Because since they're not in the biosphere, right? It's not like a direct consumption of matter the way like standard parasites are. So is it like they're feeding on attention, information? How would you think about like once they get into this state of sort of like operating in like a meme space or in a culture, like what is the medium that they feed on and that makes like them grow?
Okay, so the quick answer is negentropy. And the longer answer is I really do enjoy framings like the ones that say Yosha Bach uses sometimes when he talks about, most eukaryotic life is in some sense descended from fungus. Like animals are more closely related to fungus than we are to plants, for example, right? So we have like a sort of fungal and probably before fungal archaea type lineage to our, like our species and ourselves. And so yeast is like a single-celled fungus thing that's sort of like the simplest case of like the sort of thing that we are. In other words, the sort of thing that a heterotroph is, something that eats other creatures, as opposed to like an autotroph, meaning like a plant, something that photosynthesizes from free energy from the sun, right? So basically, what we've got going on here is a situation in which we basically have the yeast strategy is to sit in the middle of a gradient between entropy and negentropy and harvest the information flow there, right? So that's the sort of basic model of how any sort of heterotroph operates. And so what we're talking about as the food for parasitic intersubjectivity, parasitic egregores, is something like harvesting negentropy or free energy, which would otherwise exist in human minds and in human intersubjective fields, if that makes sense.
Any follow-up share or question, Hazard?
What's the so is this like free energy, is that also like stuff that could otherwise be put towards I guess like thinking, planning, like living life, like the free energy
precisely.
that are used to like figure things out and do things and act in the world?
This is my take. Yes, that's what you just said is correct, basically. And so one way to think about this is if you use things like, say, the models favored by QRI, things like the connectome-specific wave harmonic theory that gives rise to things like neural annealing, even be a concept, right? And then this lets you relate to things like what we often call trauma as a sort of crystallized or stuck pattern in the mind space of the connectome of a human brain that is like maladaptive to the current circumstances of the human organism's life, which is carrying around this brain with it. Then when you do a neural annealing process, part of why you feel more capable afterwards, part of why things like, according to this model, things like MDMA-assisted psychotherapy are so useful is because they allow for a raising of a neurological connectome analog of temperature and allow for something like metallurgical annealing in the sense of heat treatment of a metal to increase its desirable metallurgical properties. And this results in a redistribution of energy and a freeing of energy that was going towards the maintenance of a maladaptive connectomic structure, right? So like we want to be able to use the free energy that we have access to anneal our perspectives into more accurate and more compassionate and more pro-social and more, procedurally just, Rawlsian just, law-like kind of structures of coordination. And we find ourselves unable to do this, unable to be fair to each other in the fundamental sense that two 5-year-olds would recognize fairness or unfairness. And we often feel, in fact, compelled to be unfair to other people and compelled to be unfair to ourselves. And so my assertion is basically that if we were not having some of our, mental mimetic free energy, like noospheric free energy, harvested in a parasitic manner by intersubjective parasites, by parasitic or demonic egregores, then we would in fact have significantly fewer things in the category that, say, Scott would call coordination problems. That's my basic assertion here. And also, by the way, if I think several people here might be into something like IFS, like internal family systems, as a modality for relating to the self. Like, we have coordination problems inside of our brain too, not just with other people. And why is that so bad? Well, it makes a lot more sense if you think of a sort of parasite siphoning off the free energy that we would otherwise use to neurally anneal and work out the disagreements between our own internal systems. So that's the sort of take I'm presenting here, basically.
All right. Terry, you had a question.
First, I want to be sure I'm understanding you on Moloch. You're saying Moloch is an example of what you're citing, but the explanation about coordination is not appropriate. No, so Moloch is not an example.
Oh, well, okay. So yes, I would agree that Scott Alexander has identified a thing that he's calling Moloch, that is in some sense a real thing, right? And I think that the real thing that he's talking about is far better summarized by the classical definition of Moloch as the demon god of Carthage that you burn your babies as a sacrifice to in order to achieve victory and battle against other human societies, than it is as a sort of like not alive, abstract sort of like metaphor for like generalized coordination problems and tragedies of the commons. I think that, our evolutionary lineage, starting with the earliest multicellular life, essentially already learned how to solve tragedies of the commons. That's deeply encoded in our genome at this point. And so there's got to be something weirder going on than just coordination problems are hard as an explanation of why we seem to look everywhere and see Moloch, basically.
I'm sorry, you're completely throwing me. I was with you right up until your last point about the collective, about the kinds of things that show up in the collective as a result. To me, it's feeling like everything you described infects the individual, because privilege, for example, privilege benefits the individual. So the individual isn't hurt.
Right. So what I've been talking about in terms of intersubjective parasitology, if we go back to my last slide, which I won't like throw up on the screen, but I'm basically saying that these things exist at a higher trophic level than human cultures. They infect human cultures, and they infect the sets of rules and norms and our sense of procedurality and law and justice. And so this ends up being of benefit to some individual humans for some period of time, in the same way that a ant infected by cordyceps gets to have more resources that it gets to eat. But the ant is not a reproductively viable agent, right? It's part of a colony organism. And what I'm saying is, if we take a point of view similar to something like Teilhard de Chardin, where humanity is sort of moving towards evolving into even more of a colony organism, even more into an intersubjective we rather than a personal subjective I type thing, and trying to find the right balance between that the unequal distribution of reward, the unfair and unequal distribution of reward that is caused by the infection of human culture by parasitic egregores, leads to individual humans receiving privilege and advantage, and many more individual humans receiving disprivilege and disadvantage, in a way that like basically screws up our attempts to have, fair and equitable credit allocation schema for tracking contribution, credit and debt, for coordinating with each other, basically. So it's in essence parasitizing the intersubjective machinery of human coordination, full stop.
Well, that would be Moloch, parasiting coordination.
So if you read Meditations on Moloch, he's sort of tongue-in-cheek framing this as like an egregore, but the way that the discourse around meditations on Moloch has evolved with Scott and the other members of the rationalist community, they're not relating to this thing as a life form in an unironic way. They're relating to it as something like a ground truth about coordination itself, something that you have to invent a new technology to overcome. And what I'm saying is that you don't need to invent a new technology to overcome this. You need to do what Plato called anamnesis. You need to unforget an old and built-in technology that we all have, rather than invent a new thing.
Well, it sure feels like a life force in the way of doing that is why I'm a little confused about that.
Well, I agree with you that there is, in fact, a thing that you could properly regard as something like an agent or a living thing in between us and our ability to do that successfully. And I'm arguing that the correct way to relate to this is, in fact, as a parasitic agent that exists in the noosphere, rather than as an inherent emergent mathematical property of any attempt to coordinate at all, basically.
All right, thanks, Terry. Suspended reason, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not actually totally sure if this is going to be productive to kind of keep going down this road, because it is related to what Terry just brought up. So we can totally pass on this, but I guess the intuition that there's a meaningful link between what bacteria in a relatively stable environment can solve over 1 billion years of evolution, that the fact that that happened, meaning that it is easy for us to regularly, spontaneously improvise and design new coordination strategies for brand new environments that are constantly emerging in a very volatile, very rapidly paced changing culture and society. I just am not quite able to bridge why you think one really is pertinent to the other here.
Okay, so like the basic structure here is that one of the ways that bacteria solve this problem, an example of this is something called quorum sensing, right? Are you familiar with this?
I'm not.
Okay, so quorum sensing is a way that bacteria avoid overpopulation. They essentially evolve, a sort of genetic key and lock type things where there are, ways of modulating the epigenetic expression of bacterial genomes that are correlated with each bacteria like leaking a small amount of a certain active substance into the environment, so such that when the absolute levels of this substance in the environment result in a certain level of diffusion through bacterial membranes into the bacterial interior of the cell, then the epigenetic expression of the bacterial behavior is caused to change by this. There's a feedback loop with the environment and the other bacteria, which allows bacteria to avoid overpopulation and that sort of ecological catastrophe pretty elegantly, right? And like, if you want to think about the ways in which that would have applications to humans, I can like try to include a lot of the like detailed gears of this model in a future session. But basically the idea here is that, something that gets talked a lot about in the Stoa and other adjacent spaces is that we in fact do have the ability to like vibe with each other, right? We have the ability to vibe with each other and, sort of like connect our subjectivities into an intersubjective field that's not necessarily inherently verbal or inherently even like quite contentful, but that allows for a sort of like tensegrity structure to be created that can serve a sort of communicational function where we can solve coordination problems in this way, like the way that a bunch of people on a dance floor just vibing out to really good music, even if it's not a structured dance, like a line dance or a contra dance or something like that, that generally people are not getting hurt, despite that there is a large number of human bodies often in like frenetic, rapid, and highly energetic motion, right? We don't have to like speak words to each other and have a gigantic set of laws to not hurt each other on the dance floor. We can just sort of vibe through that, right? And so I guess what I'm arguing is that the combination, the fact that humans have evolved language capacities with which we can construct legal ontologies, and separately we have evolved capacities to like do the intersubjective field vibe thing, seems to me to indicate that we have all of the requisite necessary components of like just easily dealing with coordination problems. And so it's something along those lines. And I'm happy to make a point of including more detail on that part of the model in one of the next 4 sessions.
Thanks, that was super helpful. If I'm allowed a quick follow-up, just to clarify, so I understand your position, is it closer to that the view that when you say, we previously knew how to do these things, we need to rediscover old ways, is the idea that culture has essentially gotten in the way of us being able to use these old strategies? Or is the view that culture, for instance, science and our understanding of how bacteria organize, could show us ways that we can move forward? Or is it a bit of both?
So the best way I have to answer that question is to refer to some of Forrest Landry's work, where he talks about, his three modalities of the eminent, the transcendent, and the omniscient. And he has axioms regarding those modalities, which are useful for making certain kinds of points. So from these modalities in the tripartite triple relationship, where the eminent is the most fundamental, and then the omniscient and the transcendent are conjugate, right? We can sort of take a view like this, and he has a formal triple of strategy, vision, and culture, where strategy is omniscient, vision is transcendent, and culture is eminent, meaning it's the most fundamental, right? So one of the visible, symptoms of this sort of egregoric parasitism is I am asserting is that instead of relating to the eminent, to the intersubjective as the most fundamental, we instead fool ourselves into thinking that the omniscient, the objective, the third person, the view from nowhere is the most fundamental. And so we start from strategy first rather than culture first or vision first, which, we can, maybe I should just have Forrest on for one of these sessions and try to do a dialogue about this particular point. But if you go look at his work, it's very clear that there are extremely predictable effects of going strategy first, of going omniscient first. And these effects look like things like forgetting that there are forms of ethics other than consequentialism, and in particular utilitarianism, forgetting that virtue ethics and deontology are even a thing, right? Forgetting that vision is even a thing, forgetting that no matter how good your strategy is, if you don't have the right culture, you cannot implement it successfully, you cannot follow through, right? And so basically what I'm saying is that there is a sort of, from this lens, a sort of omniscient bias to the way that we attempt to solve problems. And I'm asserting that this is that the fact that, say, rationalist adjacent thinkers thinking about the Moloch egregore will relate to this as a fundamental ground truth about the nature of coordination that falls right out of game theory is an example of the omniscient bias in action, and is a reason why rationalist and EA types have such a hard time coordinating for grand projects.
That really helped clarify. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Victor Piper, you got a question?
Hey, thank you, Peter. Evan, good to see you again, mate.
Good to see you
yeah.
again. Been a while.
Yeah, it has. So as you were going through the Kiriarchy part and like asserting like the linkage with the generator function, my mind made an association simply because I happened to be reading a book, reading Prometheus Rising by Albert Anton Wilson, and the association was like, so in that 8-circuit model of mind, right? It seemed like what this this series addresses is like issues related to power dynamic, and I may be like over rotating on that, but so it seems like those anti-patterns are like, so it makes sense to start there, given the salience of like these kind of dynamics being highly visible in our relational dynamics with mass media, social media. So like totally makes sense to start there, and I really look forward to seeing the rest of the analysis. But really, it was like, okay, is there a there? Like, is there, well, like, what are your thoughts on that 8-circuit model, and do you have thoughts about other generator functions arising from other circuits? Yeah.
Okay, so I love the 8-circuit model. It's like, I'm going to do a bad job of remembering whether the stuff I'm about to say is in Prometheus Rising or is in the book that was initially titled Exopsychology and then retitled in its second edition Infopsychology by Timothy Leary, which is where the 8-circuit model comes out of, or whether it's from Gurdjieff, which is where Timothy Leary got the 8-circuit model. But all those are way in the past. I'm going to just use the Gestalt here, right? And so in this sort of model, the circuits often end up being overtones of each other, right? So for example, the circuits roughly map to the chakras, but there's an extra one. That's cool. And so we've got this dynamic whereby the throat chakra, the 6th circuit, is an overtone of the 2nd circuit, right? A harmonic overtone of it. The same way that the heart chakra is a harmonic overtone of the root chakra, the first, and you see what I'm saying here, right? And so the second circuit or the second chakra often has to do with like our relationship to pre-existing territorial boundary issues, right? So for example, like the interior exterior boundary of an individual cell or an individual human body, or what is my personal space versus your personal space, or in a relationship, what is mine versus yours, and how do we merge these things? How do we negotiate that, right? That's like very much second circuit stuff, second chakra stuff, right? And then when we think about the sixth circuit or the sixth chakra, it has to do with, like, among other things, a sort of language, both in the mundane sense, though the mundane sense of language and reason is coming from like the third circuit or third chakra, which is associated with like the color yellow and the goddess Athena, right? So like then you have this dynamic where, well, what's going on with the sixth? It's like the magical use of language, the I create as I speak. Hebrew has two different words for to speak. One means I speak like normal humans do, and one that like is used when God speaks things into existence and when Adam names the animals and plants, right? So the sixth circuit is more that one. It's more the I create as I speak, the magical power of language, the ways in which we can, manifest. And, if it is relevant to people, I can do a sort of part of one of the sessions here on the sort of precise technical definition of manifesting, which is not what you read about in The Secret, but which is a totally real thing, right? So like there is a sort of thing that can happen as a result of this sort of, mimetic, parasitic, egregoric parasitism thing that I'm like, talking about in these sessions, that involves a subtle disruption of a creation of destructive interference in the harmonics between the undertone second circuit and the overtone sixth circuit, right? There's a similar type of interference that happens with the undertone third circuit and the overtone seventh circuit or third eye chakra, right? So like basically these are the sorts of things I was talking about when I was talking about the thing that is a result, like the left eating its the left eating its children and the right eating its dead. The left eating its children thing, I believe, comes from the Cripsis strategy of creating destructive interference in the vibrations between the second and sixth circuits and the third and seventh circuits, basically, if we want to use that sort of model. So I think it's highly relevant, and I'm happy to answer any follow-ups.
I'll take that and sit with it for now. We'll explore more in later sessions. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. All right, who's next? Amber, you have a question.
Amber in the guise of Duncan coming on here. And the main question that I have is, first off, is it possible to dialogue with these entities directly, or can they only be identified and either opposed or ignored for fair ground? And then if you are opposing them, is the best way to strike out with the sword or with identification of some kind, or to focus on a different circuit and provide a different kind of substance to the group? So like overwhelming it by creating a different kind of bacterial culture, or what is the proper way, and like how many types of these entities are there? Like you might simply respond yes, because there are so many different kinds of flora here, but I'm really curious how to engage with these once you have identified them.
Okay, so lots of questions embedded in that, basically. And so I'm going to try to answer all of them, but I might fail, in which case, after I'm done talking, remind me of the ones I didn't answer. I guess one thing to mention is that we talk about trophic hierarchies, but they're not usually strictly linear. It's not just a single food chain, it's a food web, right? As ecological models have moved to. And so like you have phenomena like something eats grass, right? And that something might be a cow, right? And then you also might have a bug that eats grass. And then, like a rabbit might eat the grass, and also you might have like a squirrel that eats the bug that eats the grass, or whatever, or some other small mammal, right? A rat maybe, right? And like it's an interesting fact that you'll notice if you spend any amount of time around farm animals, that like when they are not getting enough protein or calcium, cows will totally eat squirrels and rabbits. Deer will do this sometimes too. You can find videos online of this happening, right? So like there's a fascinating thing where it's not like there's a fully linear, like trophic hierarchy that's just a single chain. There's all kinds of interestingly webbed interrelationships. And so, although these sorts of egregores are able to have a higher trophic level and a parasitic relationship with whole human cultures, it's not actually clear that they can resist or parasitize the energies of fully actualized individual human beings. What I mean by this is, if we're going to go back to Victor's suggestion of, say, Tim Leary and Robert N. Wilson's 8-circuit model, if you've got your circuits running in enough synchrony and harmony and with enough power going through them, then like you can just see these things directly and sort of eat them, or at least like cut off parts of them and eat them. And that is an improvement to your situation, because you get negative entropy from them. You can sort of predate upon them, and you can also improve the social field in which you are embedded by, like, and Duncan, I've had some experiences with you in person that I think you know what I'm talking about here. You can just eat some of the thing that is parasitizing the intersubjective field, and alchemize it, relate to this as just energy or negentropy that then can enhance the amplitude and frequency of the 8 circuits within yourself. And so like that's definitely one part of it. And also there are, I'm working on a sort of like, the old demonologists would come up with things like Goetia and like just different like demonologies and bestiaries of the lords of hell and so on. And so like in some sense, my current area of research is creating a sort of phylogenetic tree of like plausible candidates for intersubjective parasites and how to relate to them. But that is still very much an active area of research. And so I'm like going to share as much as I can of like the preliminary results there, but I definitely don't have all the answers there. And I'm very much, this is like my active area of focus and research in a certain sense.
Great. So I guess the question being like when to devour and when to create an alternate like holon or an alternate wellness that actually overwhelms. Because like I imagine that some of these, their strategy is to get you to engage in them or with them in order to feed them, or like even opposing them is actually an ineffectual move.
So like people talk about sometimes, I think you and I have talked about the notion that certain atypical neurotypes of humans are useful for doing things like splitting an in-group when it exceeds the Dunbar number, specifically things like what we call schizophrenia. Seeing things that most people don't see in that way seems to serve as a valuable way for human groups to find a natural way to do a sort of like cellular mitosis of the group when it exceeds the ability to coordinate using our built-in natural coordination mechanisms. And so like the role of profit, things like this are like related, right? And so when we talk about a human group that's like a Dunbar scale N group, part of this is I think that group has maybe created or maybe just entered into a symbiotic as opposed to parasitic relationship with something that you could reasonably call a non-parasitic egregore as a sort of organizing principle for the intersubjective substrate. Like, where do laws come from? They come from God. Well, which God? Hopefully not a parasite. So like, you see what I'm saying? So like, we can look at this sort of like historical probable role of, say, the schizophrenic neurotype as like, well, yeah, sometimes if you have a group of people that are unable to vibe and track, credit and debt and history with the group that has now become so large that you can't know everyone, then like you have a prophet type figure who is generally of the sort of schizophrenic with maybe some of the autistic neurotype mixed in. So they're tracking details and seeing the unseen such that they are able to catalyze a cellular mitosis type thing to happen within this, human colony organism. And so ideally, this happens in such a way as to avoid these two new cells going to war with each other. Human cells, multicellular life cells split all the time, and like we don't go to war with each other, and it's great, but sometimes they do. And so when the split happens such that a war then takes place, it indicates something like either the initial egregore that was perceived as a symbiont is actually a parasite, or the new egregore that has arisen, either been created by or now is being channeled by the new prophet, is a parasite and is causing a reduction in the ability of the now distinct human groups to achieve non-zero sum gains from trade type infinite game, rather than zero sum or negative sum warfare or like strict like Wall Street style trading relationship. So does that help?
Yeah, I think that just identifying these things can move downstream in actually making coordination strategies. So
Yeah, like this is one way in which,
this is one way in
like,
which, like,
interacting with people, well, like a lot of my friends, people like yourself, people like Peter, people like a lot of the people that I cherish in my life the most, is that we have enough shared symbolic and imaginal vocabulary to be able to triangulate and pinpoint the nature, at least at a somewhat fuzzy but like somewhat in focus level, of the sorts of egregoric forces that we find ourselves encountering within our shared intersubjective fields. And it's like the the archetypes provide a vocabulary for this process, is one of the quotes from Hakim Bey's Broadsheets of Ontological Anarchy article on sorcery, right? And so like he defines sorcery as something like harnessing non-ordinary perceptions to create actual changes in the world, or like Don Juan via Carlos Castaneda defines sorcery as the act of embodying certain theoretical and practical observations about the nature of the interaction between perception and reality, as I discussed in the last Bridge series. And so like the ability of people who in this use of the word are magicians or sorcerers or have non-ordinary perceptions or are trying to do something beautiful together, to create human experiential art together, to make everyone's experience more kind, more aligned, more beautiful, right? As a gift. Well, like it really helps if we share people like that, share enough of the sort of archetypal vocabulary. And it doesn't really matter which traditions this comes from, just that enough of it is shared that we can do the triangulation thing, where we can share our experiences and get some parallax on the noosphere in that way.
Thank you, Duncan. I have a follow-up. I wonder if you could generalize some of the individual encounters that you alluded to that inform this theory. I think that might help ground some people.
There's a phenomenon where I seem to go through life and I seem to encounter wonderful, beautiful, intelligent, caring, kind human beings who enter into relationship and group field with other beings for whom all of those descriptors are also true. And there seems to be a utterly weird emergence of conflict that doesn't make any fucking sense, basically. Like people who ought to be each other's natural allies, people who have the most basic sense of almost perfectly aligned interests. Like, for example, people who literally have children together. So like it doesn't get more aligned interest than that for individual beings, right? Having like what from my perspective looks like totally fucking crazy conflict erupting, right, is not because of defects of the individual people, is my assertion. I've been observing this and interacting with this for years now, and trying to help people. And I've moved into doing that basically full time. And so like, I look at this and I'm like, I can't locate the generator of this conflict in you as a person, person A. I can't locate the generator of this conflict in person B. It's not in either one of them. It's outside of them. It's somewhere in the intersubjective field, right? And then I notice that I'm trying to help a lot of different people relate to each other. Like, I'm trying to build bridges, like the bridge, right? I'm trying to literally just help people build bridges between their perspectives so that they can express the beautiful positive things like love and happiness and joy together more easily, right? With a shared language. Like this is part of what we talked about in the last bridge session, and discuss their inner experience in a way that makes it legible to others, and that like people can appreciate each other's beauty. And so like I'm noticing that like, wow, these are all just categorically great fucking people. I love them all. And these weird conflicts keep erupting that don't make any sense. It's like sometimes people seem to feel compelled to change a group field, which is moving in a positive sum, infinite game kind of direction into a group field that is defined by, at best, zero sum and often negative sumness. The sort of fight between two best friends or two lovers where both people come out worse off at the end. Imagine things in my life, like the worst drunk night where you and your best friend got into a terrible fight that was stupid and only happened because you were drunk, and then like your relationship is damaged and you have to burn some resources to repair it, right? Like there's a reason that our word alcohol comes from an Arabic term al-Ghul, right, which means the demon which devours men from within, right? So like that's the sort of thing that is relevant here, right? Is like, where is this coming from? Why is there, because so in that case, two best friends get into a fight and then have to burn resources to repair their relationship. Well, we can just point to exactly that egregore in this case. We can say it was the egregore called al-Ghul, which has the ability to create neurotransmitters that have GABA activity, right? Okay, ethyl alcohol, and which has in this case, not quite a parasitic relationship with human society, because there's a lot of theories out there. The originators of these theories I'm not remembering right now, but I can do the research and include it in the next session, of like a lot of the ability of human society to build into larger scale structures seems to have to do with the generalized disinhibitory response and relaxation response created by GABA agonism of alcohol, of ethyl alcohol, right? So like at least alcohol, it may be the demon that devours men from within, but it also like gives us something back in return, so that it's not totally clear that humanity and al-Ghul are playing a negative sum game, maybe a zero sum game. I doubt positive sum, but it's possible. Further research is required. So like that's some of the flavor of the stuff I've been experiencing and relating to, is like, why are you guys fighting? You are business partners and best friends. Why are you guys fighting? You have kids together. Like, you see what I'm saying? Like and the normal way of relating to this is, oh, their egos are getting in the way. But I do not subscribe to the points of view. I mean, I'm kind of a Buddhist, but I am not the kind of Buddhist that thinks that the ego is a bad guy. I think ego structure is one of the levels of, emergent sense making and the sort of virtualism flavored like generation of a subjective world with which to plan and make sense of our experience that I talked about in the previous Bridge session. And so like, I'm not going to be like, oh, it's just because of their egos. There's something deeper going on there that is causing the ego to be generated in a way which is preferring conflict to coordination. And so I don't locate the source of this within the individual human beings. I locate it within the noosphere, within the intersubjective group field, as an emergent property of the interaction of many human minds over relatively low timescales of evolutionary time, basically.
All right. Brandon, you had a question.
Oh, yeah. So, what's interesting is some of the examples you gave, they're about kind of different things, right? And some of them are with the ants. I'm thinking, okay, so the ants don't have a noosphere. And I'm trying to just recognize, there's different kinds of morphogenetic processes that apply at different levels, different planes. And just like my core map for this is Greg Enriquez TOK that has 4 levels, right? And so I think this is kind of useful, because whereas with Terry Chardin, he has noosphere coming right out of the biosphere, but then if you add in that level of the zoosphere, zoo meaning like animal, like that's the mind, right? And so we can more clearly sort then some of these phenomena in the zoosphere rather than the noosphere. And so I think what you're talking about is like you're talking about a generalized morphogenic process of parasitism, which could apply to our minds, and also could apply to our culture. So it applies then sometimes within the zoosphere and sometimes within the noosphere. And I'm not sure if that made sense, but you can let me know if you need some clarification.
So I'm going to answer this in a weird way. I think I know what you mean. And if my answer doesn't address your question, then feel free to follow up and tell me that and clarify. But I guess I'm going to answer by saying that we can observe these interactions between, say, ants. They're in the zoosphere, right? And we can observe them as having interactions that are primarily happening in the material world, right? And so this is something where you're right, there's not that much of an intersubjective field being created in the same sense that human interaction creates this space of a noosphere to emerge. But um, I said material with a certain kind of emphasis, material world, right? Well, like, we don't actually live in a material world, right? We live in a physical world, but not a material world. Material is derived from the Latin root mater, right? Of the mother, right? Like the earth is the mother. Things that are earth-like and rock-like are material, right? And so if we want to like slightly shift over metaphorical systems out of the Roman and into something like the Vedic, well, like that's Shakti. And there's also Shiva. There's mind and matter, right? And we live in a world which is physical, as in operates according to something like quantum field theory. But in quantum field theory and quantum mechanics, there's not quite any such thing as matter, right? There's an amplitude wave, there's a probability distribution, there's all these kinds of things. There are things which are observed, right? Which is an inherently, in some sense, Shivic or mental process, right? So what I'm saying is that for beings like us, which are still emerging from the sort of zoo world field, we have a sort of anchoring of our experience and our consciousness and our intersubjectivity in the material half of the dualism between mind and matter, right? And so, like, we perceive those things more easily because of where we came from. But this doesn't, according to me, make the ultimate reality material. I believe that it's physical, that it is law-like, that it follows, you know, a sensible sort of transition function between that correlates adjacent states. But I don't think that we live in a fully material world. I think that I mean, you and I probably live in material worlds, which are the virtuality generated by our brain's attempt to sense make what's coming in through our perceptual sense doors. But that doesn't mean that reality is material. It just means that we generate a material-based virtual reality to make sense of things because of our limited capacities, right? And so it is easier for us to observe these sorts of dynamics from a third-person perspective when looking at something like the zoo world of, you know, zoosphere of ants and cordyceps existing within that frame, because they're even more materially biased than we are. But like I am, though I'm not quite fully a Buddhist, I'm definitely a sort of non-dualist. And I think that, you know, I'm trying to point to the existence of similar dynamics on the other side of the perceived dualism, in the mind side rather than the matter side, basically.
Any follow-up, Brennan?
Not right now. I'm looking forward to the rest of the series.
Cool. Let's go to Andrew. Andrew, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks. It felt like Girardian mimetic desire kind of felt in, plugged into here in some way, and I was just kind of like meta on this. Like, what's the relationship between something like mimetic desire and one of these demon egregores? And I was thinking, like, is it an element of the noosphere, mimetic desire, kind of fundamental, or is it like fertilizer, like something that just makes it easier for them, or maybe it's one of the things that sends us into the high concentration of the population, you know, where then maybe we spread it out more that way because we need to be around people to desire things, or maybe it doesn't matter, or I don't know. I was just curious what the relationship might be between the egregore, the demon egregore, the parasite, and something like mimetic desire.
You know, man, maybe I should send out like a Google form or something, figuring out which directions the next sessions want to take, because that's one thing I could spend a whole session on, basically. But I guess I'm thinking that, like, so there's a quote by, is it Plato or Aristotle? But he talks about a man who lives alone in the wilderness is not really a man, but is either an animal or a god, right? You know, and so like, you know, I think it's Girard who said that man is the creature who does not know what to desire, and so he turns to others in order to make up his mind. And this is sort of the thing with mimetic desire, right? So we could bring into this like Buddhist or Hindu, like sort of Vedic tradition, 6 realms theory here, right? You know, like hot hells, hungry ghosts, animals, humans, asuras, devas, right? And we could like look at things through this lens, right? And so like the asuric realm is dominated by mimetic desire. And the human realm is like adjacent to that. And so mimetic desire is operative here, but humans have a lot more potentials, actually. There's the reason that in these lines of thought, the human realm is the one you can walk out of the whole damn building, you can get out of the cycle of, right? And so, like, I guess the way I would relate to this is mimetic desire, I don't think is a bad thing. I think mimetic desire is part of the substrate from which we can build distributed compute networks of human minds, or to put it another way, collective intelligences, or to put it another way, reach the omega point and actualize, a greater kind of being for ourselves while still allowing ourselves to have the relevant kinds of individuality, right? But if you do only mimetic desire, if you stay firmly planted only in like that sort of place, then you're not able to perceive, right? My friend Ben Hoffman wrote an interesting article about it's called The Order of the Soul, I believe, on his blog, if people want to Google it. And it talks about, it's sort of a comparative study of different tripartite models of the soul from different eras. So for example, you have the Greek, like epithumia, thumos, and logos, right? You have the Vedic, like the tamas, rajas, and sattva, right? And in these older systems, the upper center, the upper part of the soul, the head part of the soul is related to as a perceptual faculty. It's a sense organ, like the way that the Buddhists talk about the mind as a sense door, right? And then you transition to the modern day and you have like Freudian psychology, which has basically like the id maps pretty cleanly on to epithumia. And, the ego maps pretty cleanly onto thumos. But then the superego is not really a perceptual faculty. It's a pattern of conditioning inherited from structures of domination and authority within your family and your society that's constantly yelling at you about what you're doing wrong, right? So somehow there's been a shift over the past few thousand years where the top part of the soul is no longer related to as a natural perceptual faculty, but is now related to as a nagging voice of domination, right? And I think that's what happens when you have a society which has overbalanced itself into mimetic desire and away from human direct perception of what we might actually want that might actually be of interest to us.
Any follow-up, Andrew? Okay.
No, I don't think so. No, it's a lot to think about. I'm going to read that blog post. Thanks.
Christy, you had a question.
Can you hear me? Hey, Evan, welcome back. Yeah, so I was wondering if you read Gorm and metaphorism as a way to sort of like bridge how different groups conceive of the world. So like when you have like groups that are very objectively minded and you have very groups that are subjectively minded, maybe the in between is like the metaphor to like make up that we can't really make fully sense of reality. What do you think about that?
Can you give me a little bit more background on the nature of your question? Because I'm not sure I actually am successfully dereferencing the pointer that you're using with metaphorism.
Maybe if I give you like the Substack or something?
No, okay, yeah, gotcha. So, okay, so there, yeah, I'm familiar with the existence of this Substack, I guess. So, like, it's funny, metaphor as a word, right? Like, literally basically means bridging in the sense that I use it, right? Like, metaphor in Greek is literally just to carry across. Well, what do you carry something across? A bridge, right? So I think that, like, there is a sense in which different human neural cognitive architectures, both genetically determined and determined through the dance between our early experiences and our, and our genetics and epigenetics, like means that we end up in pretty, notably different sorts of mind configurations, some of which are going to be more oriented towards the thing that you might call objective inquiry, right? Where you're going to want to go deeper, like even like, so let's go back to Forrest again. If the eminent is the most fundamental, you're going to want to go, some people are going to want to go deeper into like perceiving in the omniscient modality, and they're going to be like the great scientists and so on. And some people are going to want to go deeper into perceiving in the eminent modality, and they're going to be like the great artists and visionaries or whatever, right? And like, that's great, right? And so like, yeah, I mean, I think that there's something here where like one of the reasons that those two camps or those two sets of neurotypes have such a hard time relating, I think, is not actually due to the fact that they are doing something that is in conflict. In fact, they're doing something which is in mutual support of each other. And like, if you look at the history of real innovation, like there's a book called What the Dormouse Said, which is about the deep interconnections between like esoteric, occult, and psychedelic culture and the invention of computer and information technology. Like the one couldn't have happened without the other and vice versa, right? You know, you look at the ways in which, you know, some of our greatest scientists have experiences, you know, like the whole you know, Watson and Crick discovering the helical structure of DNA, and depending on which source you believe, a dream or an LSD trip, right? You know, the benzene ring showing up in a dream. Like these two domains are not as separate as we might pretend they are, right? And that's because there's this intersubjective linkage between the two of them, right? And so when we talk about parasites of intersubjectivity, right? Again, one of the effects we might expect to observe given such a hypothesis is a generalized perception among many humans of a conflict between those two ways of relating, which is in fact not really the case. But that perception of conflict is sort of like a way of relating to that as part of the like proboscis of the parasite, which is stuck into us, which is sucking out our energy, basically, right? Might be one way to think about this.
Any follow-up, Chris?
I guess my curiosity lies in that I find that the average person listens to stories and yeah, it's like stories and I guess analogies better than facts. So can you sort of, I don't know, tease out that a bit more? Like if we're trying to do something practical here and we're trying to like do a sort of something that relates to the most people or does the most good for most people, wouldn't it be towards the direction of, I guess, stories?
Yeah. And I mean, like, so in some sense, you could relate to this session and the series of sessions that I'm doing as telling a story rather than presenting a set of facts, right? Because I take your point there, right? I also want to argue with the distinction, though. And I want to argue that the fact that we perceive a distinction there is itself, I think, a symptom of this sort of parasitism, right? So, like, if you go back a while, like, take, like, so often people describe atomic theory as being like originated by Democritus and then really explicated by Lucretius and De Rerum Natura, right? And so De Rerum Natura is written in dactylic hexameter, right? It's an epic poem that happens to be about science, right? And similarly, the Iliad, also written in dactylic hexameter, is an epic heroic story about Metis, right? So like these were both stories and factual to the Greeks, right? And to the Romans, you know? And so this like sharp and hard boundary between a narrative structure, a rhythmic prosody type structure, which has a resonance, and facts, the whole phenomenon of the disjointed, dry, utterly unable to be connected with from the heart modern academic voice is, according to me, a freaking terrible consequence of the sort of intersubjective parasitism that we are you know, subject to in the current regime. And like I want to mention here as a follow-up, like, so Andrew just put in the chat, he asked if I have read There Is No Anti-Memetics Division by QNTM, part of the SCP Foundation. And yes, I have, and I'm essentially asserting that there is something like the big bad from that actually exists. And there is an anti-memetic field around this topic such that you are likely to be labeled as a crackpot or a charlatan if you describe it at all, and people will choose to not understand and not remember what you say. I've noticed in the chat people are having a hard time relating to and comprehending the content of this talk. Well, it's recorded, and I don't think that there are anti-memetic super weapons that are going to delete the Stoa's YouTube anytime soon. So I'm essentially saying that we're basically in that situation, but the anti-memetic entities are a lot weaker to applied human intent than they even are in that story. And in that story, I think love wins in the end. So yeah.
Cool. maybe I'll land us with one more question. In the event description, you put, we seem to have lost most of our ability to perceive and relate to the intersubjective phenomenon our ancestors might have called demons. I'm actually reading this book, Slaying Dragons, What Exorcists Seen and What We Should Know. In the trad Cath community, traditional Catholic, they have this, like, they're really into diabolical influence, and they have like 6 different stages: temptation, vexation, oppression, obsession, possession, and subjugation. So I'm curious if any tradition, the Christian traditions, notion of demons, or any other traditions that you've looked at that you think are useful, perhaps metaphoric utility, or things that get right, things that get wrong.
So I can and probably will do a whole session basically on that question, but for a flavor of it, so like, can you guys see this? So that's a Tibetan Tanka, Vajrayogini, right? Who is the wisdom essence energy of cutting through delusion and preserving life as a female 16-year-old Buddha, basically, who is like taken all of Shiva's tools for herself, as like a kind of first order lossy approximation of what Vajrayogini is all about, right? And like from certain perspectives, from the perspective of a patriarchal social system, for example, Vajrayogini is clearly a demon, right? Because she's going to cut through the tensile strength of the illusory web with which patriarchy binds itself together, right? But from the perspective of a tradition of self-liberation, she's basically the highest God form that you can do deity yoga with. So it's kind of subjective, but we can, I think, through our shared experiences, reach intersubjective agreement. I mean, I find it interesting that everybody as diverse as the Bonpo and the Tibetan Buddhists, as well as the Western esoteric tradition, find that there is a relevance of tools involving a dagger and a bell, right? This is common in exorcism rituals, even in Christian traditions, right? Because the bell, the pure tone of the bell with aligned overtone harmonic series will scare away some of the demons, meaning that like it might interact with the resonances in something like an 8th circuit Timothy Leary, Robert Anton Wilson style model to disrupt the destructive interference between the circuits that, you know, is being brought by this like intersubjective parasite. And then the dagger is for, well, the exorcism didn't really work, so now I'm going to have to take the infected out, you know, a la the zombie movie, right? And so like the traditional tools of shamanism and exorcism are basically the same, and are the dagger and the bell, along with, you know, overtone singing, rhythmic chanting, mantra practice, things that sort of look like this, right? You could call it Hail Marys, or you could call it mantra, same damn thing, right? So yeah, I mean, I've done quite the survey over the past 15 years of different traditions of demonology and different ways of relating to this, and I think that they're all basically making the same mistake that QAnon does. And so what I mean by this is that QAnon seems to be a genuine human impulse to react to the presence of things like the Jeffrey Epstein phenomenon, right? Things whereby it is obvious that there is in fact an epidemic of sexual abuse of minors of unknown degree going on by extremely powerful people. But something like QAnon, according to me, is mistargeted in a way that is non-random. It is precisely calculated to be just wrong enough to be not a threat to the actual power structure, which depends on domination and sexual abuse for its tensile strength. So demonology traditions in general seem to be making the same kind of mistake as QAnon, which is they're speaking about a thing that's real, but they get the specifics in a way that is calculatedly just wrong enough such that people will still feel a resonance with participating in the tradition, but it will be predictably mistargeted and not anger the actual powerful entities that it's actually angry about.
That is going to be a juicy session indeed. Looking forward to that one. Evan, any parting words you'd like to leave us with today? We've reached the 90 minutes.
I just really want to thank everyone for coming. It's an honor to be back here on the Stoa. I continue to be grateful for the creation and cultivation of this space, Peter. And I don't show up in person all the time because my life has gotten crazy, but I do still watch recordings, and I'm just so very grateful that this space continues to exist, that you continue to hold the space, that I continue to be invited back, and that people have continued to choose to show up and enter into dialogue with what I have to say. That's just really wonderful. Thank you.
Beautiful. Man, thank you, my friend. It's great to have you back. You're at the Stoa, and we're here next week, same time, same Stoa. So feel free to RSVP, and then we'll see you then. So Evan, everyone, thanks so much for going to Stoa today.
Thank you.